So here we are in Australia. The weather has been rather un-Australian though. Wet and cool so far, the effect of La Nina weather system apparently, which I'm told was last in evidence in Australia in the summer here of 2010-11. And most of us remember what happened in that Ashes series. Well, I have with me Jonathan Agnew, who's starting his 9th Ashes tour, England bowler Stephen Finn, who was part of 3 Ashes tours and certainly experienced the highs and lows of playing out here, including being part of the last England side to win in Australia 10 years ago, and Andy Zaltzman is with us to cast a statistical eye on the build-up to an Ashes series. We thought we'd talk on this episode about those opening days of an Ashes tour and how challenging they can be, plus how build-ups have changed. Jonathan, what about the sledging? Everyone talks about the sledging when you come to Australia. When does it start? Has it started in your experience at the airport? It has for me. It happened to me once.
Not quite as early as that, but I mean, the difference this time, of course, is we're not actually with the players. But normally we'd go to Perth, settle in. Those early days are all about getting to the jet lag and acclimatising to the very different conditions you get there as well. I mean, the players, those quick bouncy pitches in the nets and so on, so it all felt a bit different, but the nets and all the practice games within themselves would be obviously very closely monitored by the Australian press. The West Australian press always got the first go at the Poms, if you like. And so they'd play a warm-up game or two between themselves. I remember Graham Gooch, he broke a finger, or he suddenly injured a finger, dropping a catch in one of those warm-up games between themselves. And then, funnily enough, he then played tennis against me and thrashed me 6-love. And the sweat from his racket got into his hand and really badly infected it. So they got to Adelaide, he had to have an operation all the way, sort of cut his hand open, and he missed the first Test match. And Alan Lamb actually was captain then. But it does start a bit of a trend, I think, those early days on a tour. Lilac Hill was always an interesting experience. It was like they like to think that it was like an Australian Arundel. Anyone who's been to Arundel to watch, that happened now, but those lovely warm-up games, very genteel and all very nice. Well, Lilac Hill was just like sort of a circus act. I mean, I remember the gum trees and thousands of very drunk Australians just let rip to go and give the Poms a good going over, and it was extraordinary. So sort of trundle back to Perth feeling a bit bruised, sometimes having lost. Then you'd play West Australia, and that was obviously quite serious. They'd often beat England actually. Then you go to South Australia, to Adelaide, but also up country games as well. So what was really nice about those tours was you did get quite a feel for the place. I remember going up to Geraldton, was a little sort of fishing town north of Perth, again for a 3-day against the country 11s and so on. There's this farmer up there, Miles Obst, there's a name for you, Miles Obst, who while he was taking wickets against England, his farm was being ravaged by plagues of locusts. Some of these are the sort of stories that you remember from these things go by. But it was part of the colour, part of the feel of it.
In my experience, one of the things that happens on Ashes tour is that the England team, as they land, are labelled the worst team ever to come to Australia. Is that your experience as well? Is every England team that comes here the worst team ever to come to Australia?
Oh yeah, I mean the coverage here is pretty biased, isn't it? I mean, those of us who've read Malcolm Conn for years will know that. But it is all part of sort of the building up of it as well. To get some public interest going. But no. I mean, I can't remember ever an England team arriving here remotely as favourites. There might have been in our minds once or twice. Not very often. It's tough to come here and win. But no. It's Australia all the way. And they're very clever with the promoting of Australian cricket. Remember the Go Aussie Go ads that used to go and so on. They sort of misty-eyed kids and Don Bradman and all that. They really perhaps have taken their foot off that a little bit now. But certainly in the 90s, when Australia were winning everything, the sort of the PR side of it was very strong, and I think very motivational for lots of the kids who were there at the grounds too.
Yeah, and there was also that. I remember that theme of, is it worth playing 5 matches? Let's just play 3. Let's just reduce an Ashes series to 3.
Let's hope it's competitive this time. I used to hear that. You go, oh, shut up. That sort of thing used to put up with.
I mean, I remember the story about arriving at the airport. I was just getting my bag from the conveyor belt. You had a 24-hour flight. You're really groggy, tired. I remember this customs officer coming up to me with his dog, and his dog sniffing the bag. I think, oh no, what's going to happen here? I'm not going to have to go through it. Well, they take all the clothes out, and go through it. And he said, where have you come from? At London. What are you here for? Oh, I've come to cover the cricket. He said, well, the cricket? He said, your team's rubbish. You might as well just get back on the plane and go home, mate. And I was like, I wasn't even playing. So it's sledged before you even actually get into Australia.
It's done with a smile, though, don't you think, usually?
Yeah. I smiled, you smiled, but
Yeah.
but there is that sense of perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it's the same when Australia come to England, of the country being against you. Stephen, you come here as a player. What does it feel like? I mean, is it actually a much gentler experience than that?
No, absolutely not. I feel like we're very kind and gentle to the opposition teams when they come to the UK. But when you step off the plane, for the first moment, the people who open the doors up, the heat hits you, their eyes hit you. They're waiting for you, and you get into the arrivals lounge. And because we all turn up with massive kit bags with pads and bats and boots. One of the stipulations of coming into the country is that you have no dirt on the bottom of your shoes, so they take glee in stopping everyone. So my experience here, it's the first time that I've come to Australia not to play cricket for England, and it's the first time I've ever walked straight through at arrivals into the arrivals lounge and just walked in into the wild. Usually you get pulled over and they root through your bags to try and find one speck of mud on your shoes, and then they humiliate you and make you stand there and clean it yourself in front of them to make sure that you've got clean shoes to get into their country. So it does feel quite oppressive when you get off the plane, and then because you always land in Perth and you play the warm-up games and you're there acclimatising, and not many people turn up to the warm-up games, so you can hear everything that's being shouted to you from the side. And there's one guy every time, it's like he just singles me out for the abuse every time I come to Perth. And the first time we went there, we almost made a joke of it because you could hear him shouting from by the sight screen, "It's going to be a long summer, boys, get used to this heat." and this was 10-11, and you're there with all the great players, Peterson, Pryor, all those guys. I remember them being quite vocal about saying, like, get used to it because this is what it's like. And then the next time I come back to Perth, the same guy screaming and shouting at me, and he shouts, "I remember you, Finn. You were rubbish then and you're rubbish now. Get back on the plane." And you're just like, yeah. So now you're rite of passage when you walk into Australia that this one man in Perth is going to make my life very hard work.
Is anybody nice to you when you come here?
Well, actually, initially no, but if you win their respect, like, that's one of the funny things about Australians, is that if you stand up to them and you push back. So in 2010-11, my vivid memory of the tour is how with us the Australian public were. So sitting in an environment as we are here now with a group of 5 players outside a restaurant, guys would come up to you and initially they'd be saying stuff like, "It's going to be a long summer, you blokes are going to get hammered 5-0. But in 10-11, when we pushed back in that first test match and Cook, Strauss and Trott got the runs, then as we moved through the tour and we won in Adelaide, people started being nice to us, which was so strange. Remember the great players were saying, this just is so weird, people are being nice to us, but it's because we won their respect by pushing back. So that's the only time I've experienced nice Australians. All the other times I've come here we've been hammered, so it's not quite been the same experience.
The actual build-up as well, one thing that has happened on previous tours is that before Brisbane you get sent to Tasmania, and the contrast is huge, isn't it? Tasmania, freezing cold, wet, a bit like being in England really, and then you go to Brisbane, the hothouse of Brisbane. How did that sit with the journalists, the players? I don't know. Did it seem fair?
No, everyone thought it was ridiculous. But then, from an Australian point of view, if you do want to find a reason for it, it's because Hobart never had a test.
Yeah.
And so it was usually Australia A or something like that you'd play there. So it was like a proper game. And so I suspect you could say for Cricket Australia, look, this is Hobart's big game, and they want to keep encouraging cricket down there. But it's certainly, as far as preparation was concerned, I mean, it was well, not hopeless, but it certainly wasn't anything comparable to Brisbane. And Steve, you were reminding me that actually the year that we won, the bowlers had all gone up to Brisbane because the value of the game itself for England's bowlers was kind of viewed as negligible.
Yeah, I think the thing about that tour as well was we knew what the side for the first test match was going to be, barring an injury. So anyone could have done anything in those warm-up games, and you knew what that first 11 was going to be, and that's the only time I can really remember on an Ashes tour that I've been on that being the case. So the bowlers, actually, me, Swan, Anderson, Broad, got sent to Brisbane a week early to go and acclimatise with David Saker. And if acclimatising was testing the Castlemaine 4X or whatever it was for a couple of days up there. But we went up there and to get used to the heat. But usually that last tour match is just a straight shootout for places. And the other Ashes tours that I've been on here, that we haven't had that settled nature to the lineup, and it's just been whoever bowls the best or looks the best in this is the person who's going to supplement Broad and Anderson in that first test match. Whereas the 10-11 series was very different, so they were able to send us up, and luckily didn't have to sit in the cold wet rain of Hobart.
It'll be very interesting this time around, won't it? I mean, here we are sitting here and they've had so much rain up there, the practice has been virtually worthless, and yet they chose to go and do it that way. I mean, I assumed when it was announced it was through sort of COVID and travelling around reasons, but actually England have viewed the fact that actually the warm-up games that they were being given over the last couple of tours were pretty worthless anyway. So let's go and do it ourselves. We've got the Lions, so no attention, no focus, not first class, obviously good standard, but kind of really off the radar. It'll be really interesting to see how they do suddenly walk out into a full house at the Gabba, having just been warming up in this very low-profile scenario.
Yeah, but it's going to be strange for both sides, I think, because Australia have barely played a test match. So I don't think they have played a test match since the India series that they lost here at home earlier this year, and I think that's something that can't be underestimated for England, who are quite battle-hardened in test cricket. By battle-hardened, I mean they've played test cricket. They haven't necessarily torn the house down, I think, through the last year or so. But it's going to be an interesting first test match, because usually you get into that test match, and in 10-11 as well, we made a real emphasis to make those warm-up games competitive, because Andy Flower and Andy Strauss felt that in previous years, and it very much depends on the coach-captain combination that you have, but previous years it was, we'll get to, batsman will get to 70 and he'll get out, or he'll walk off the pitch because he's had enough or he's got enough. But they wanted to emphasise getting your foot on Australia's throat and getting in the habit of
winning
keeping
games
it there and winning games, and people scoring big runs, taking big wicket hauls, and actually that series we did that, and that started from the moment we got off the plane.
As a player, when you turn up, an England player, and you turn up in Australia, do you believe, or is there that bit of doubt in your mind? You're thinking this is the ultimate challenge. I mean, probably winning in India, winning in Australia, the two toughest challenges for an England cricketer. Do you have that belief, or do you have that doubt?
I think it varies. I came in 10-11 with such naivety because it was my first Ashes tour. It was only my second ever England tour. My first one was Bangladesh, where you barely leave the hotel. So this was my first proper tour with England. So I just came into it not knowing or understanding what it was all about at all. Touring in general, I was 21 years old, just turned 21 years old. I had no idea about life in general, let alone an Ashes tour. So, and we had meetings before, and because Andrew Strauss and Andy Flower, they're meticulous in the way that they prepared, and that was really impressive about them. But we had these meetings, and I remember guys saying that it's so unbelievably hard down there. It's difficult. It's oppressive when you get off the plane, when you're sat around, when you're playing the games. It's oppressive. Everything about it is difficult. So I had half an idea what to expect, but you don't. So that first tour, I was just completely naive. It was almost I was walking around just with my eyes wide open, trying to take everything in. But then when you go back and you've had those bad experiences, and I think that's the hardest thing, is to come back here after having been beaten 5-0. You're touring the same places, you land in Perth, you then go to South Australia, you then go to Hobart. It just feels like you're just slipping into the same monotony of every other tour that you've been on down here, and everything becomes so familiar. So I actually think that the guys warming up in Brisbane and having that time in Brisbane, albeit they haven't played many games, or they might not play a game at all given the weather that we've had over here so far, but it might be a nice way to break that circuit of everything that's happened on previous tours here.
So I think we can safely say this is a unique Ashes tour for all sorts of reasons. Andy Zaltzman, give us some statistical background. There's the possibility that England play hardly any cricket going into the first test, but in the past, what was it like?
Well, they used to play clearly a lot more. It's sort of come down to 3 or 4 weeks preparation in recent tours with 3 or 4 first-class games, but go way back into the distant history of the Ashes. They'd be there for months, and then of course you had the boat trip as well, often with a match in what's now Sri Lanka, on the way out. If you go right back to the very first touring team to come to Australia, they came in 1861-62, when before Test cricket existed. They sailed on the SS Great Britain, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, although the boat at the time was reeling from losing its title as the longest passenger ship in the world at 98 metres. They left Liverpool on the 20th of October, arrived in Melbourne on the 24th of December, so a full 2 months on the boat. And the first match of the tour, they had 45,000 people over 3 days, which, bearing in mind the population in Melbourne at the time, I think is equivalent to about 400,000 people turning up today. So things have clearly changed since then. The first ever test in Australia, 1877, was the 18th match of the tour, by which time England had been to and from New Zealand and lost their wicketkeeper, who'd been arrested and jailed. So these kind of things don't happen so much now. I think cricket's lost something from that, to be honest. But yeah, and then and also, and it's worth sort of bearing. So saying 54-55, one of England's few Ashes triumphs in recent decades in Australia. They played the first tour match on the 30th of September in Colombo. Then they played a game in Western Australia on the 11th of October. The first test wasn't until the 26th of November. And after all that preparation, they were absolutely hammered, but then came back to win the series. And the last test was the 25th of February, and then they went to New Zealand for 2 more test matches. So the tours were rather different in those days. But in terms of the optimum form of preparation, I'm not sure England have yet found it. In 20 series since the war, with various different lengths of build-up, England have won the first test only twice. So whatever they do, it's all going to be difficult.
Yeah, there's that big build-up to Brisbane. Brisbane's so important. It feels if you lose in Brisbane, then it's so difficult to come back in an Ashes series. I remember very clearly 1994-95, Shane Warne, the focus was on him. Do you remember? I remember him doing an interview with you, Jonathan, and it had these new deliveries he was going to bowl. And talk about the mind games on the night before the match.
They wheeled him out. We hadn't really come across Shane much because, of course, he'd come to England with the ball of the century, so he was still a very sort of mystical figure, and still very youthful and spiky-haired, and very bouncy and smiley. But yes, I remember he gave this sort of demonstration. Really, he claimed, whether it's true or not, that he and Abdul Qadir, the great Pakistan wrist spinner, had sat at the end of this long carpet together,
right, yeah.
And they just sort of just flicked balls out of their hands in various different ways, and he'd invented the Zoota. The Zoota, mate. Just wait till you see that. So it's like a crikey Zoota. What the hell's a Zoota? so it's sort of this mysterious delivery, and you go to an England player. Hey, what's a Zoota? I haven't a clue. Crikey, but it's all absolute rubbish. There's no such thing as a Zoota. But he did bowl a magnificent flipper in that match. I'll never forget the one that got Alex Stewart, LBW. It was just one of the greatest pieces of wrist spinning I've ever seen, but it wasn't a Zoota. But no, I'm with Stephen a bit, in that it could break the cycle this time, because it was, will Australia assume such dominance at the Gabba, having not played very much, and England with their strange build-up, and then here we are, we don't know where the last test match is going to be played, but just say that it isn't played over in Perth, where England routinely get hammered. Goodness knows when the last one there. I know it's a different ground, but even so, they'd never win there. So just take that out of the equation as well. And you've got the Adelaide Day-Nighter, which kind of levels things up. Just quietly coming around on the outside. I know people here certainly are making Australia firm favourites. But you can see how England actually, with things go their way a little bit, actually could surprise a few this time.
Do you see that, Stephen? How do you see that as we move towards the series, just under a couple of weeks away? How do you see England's chances?
I think Ben Stokes' inclusion is paramount to England being able to have the balance in their team to be able to compete with Australia and beat Australia. I think having him as an extra seamer and a guy who's got experience of scoring runs in Australia against a very good attack at the time he did it, I think gives England confidence. And I do think that the fact that the day-night test match, the potential of Hobart being where the 5th test match could potentially be played, I do think that in tours past, where you do feel as though you look at it and you go, the conditions, the attacks, the way that cricket generally is played over here, that you see daylight between the teams in previous tours, I do think that it narrows that gap. the prospect of the potential changes to the tour.
Yeah, you also had that big build-up, didn't you? And there's a lot of focus on the first ball in Brisbane. And talk about that 94-5. I remember Phil de Freitas, short wide outside the off stump. Michael Slater, bang four.
Steve Harmison. Steve Harmison's delivery. Dear old Steve. And I love the contrast of the commentary. There's my commentary on BBC and there's Jim Maxwell's commentary on the same thing on the ABC. Something of a contrast between the tone of the two commentators. I watched that and thought, oh no, that's the Ashes gone. It was only the first ball of the series. And you could hear Jim just down the road going, oh, wait, they felt like they'd won the Ashes already. You just that was sapping. But oh yeah, I mean but the first ball of the Ashes is it's incredibly special, and it's silly to say that it sets the tone for the whole thing. But
normally because it's outside the off stump and the batter leaves it through to the wicketkeeper, so that obviously can't set the tone.
The 10-11 Ashes series as well. Everyone talked about that first morning of the first Test match, and we're batting first. Hilton House ran up, I think, and Strauss edged the fourth ball to gully, and Hussey took an amazing catch over his head. And I was like sat there watching because I wanted to soak up the atmosphere. So I got up, I realised we weren't bowling, so got all my stuff, my comfy clothes on, went to sit in the dugout where you watch the game, and it's just over the left shoulder of the bowler as he's running in, and he was bowling from this end, from that end. That first morning I was sat there really excited, soak up the atmosphere, and then the place just erupted, 4 balls in, and I was like, I can't do this, I'm just going to be so stressed. So I went downstairs and sat underneath, and it's like being in a gladiator's den waiting to go out, and just hear like people slamming their feet on the thing. They all know you're down there, so they're slamming their feet above you. And then Siddle got the hat trick, and all the bowlers that tour, it was almost our thing that we just went to the dressing room, watched on the TV, slept, recovered, and then when we needed to, we went and did our thing. But the scrambling for pads and people jumping over each other to try and find their box and shoes and everything, it was absolute carnage that first day. And I was sat there thinking, oh no, everyone talks about everything just being a disaster, shambles. Am I experiencing it right now? And then somehow Cook, Strauss, Trott turned the tide in that Test match, and the rest of the tour is history.
Did the players talk about Brisbane being like so crucial that you have to avoid defeat in Brisbane? That's the game. And I mean, statistically, if you look back, I mean, it happened in 54-5 where England lost in Brisbane, came back to win the series, but it does not happen very often.
No, I think you set a marker down, and in 10-11 we made a real big effort to set that marker down in the warm-up games and carry that through the entire tour. We managed to do that. And I think you do put high significance on that first Test match. You don't want to be blown away.
The biggest marker, surely, we've ever seen at the Gabba, Mitchell Johnson. Yeah. The way he bowled. Oh, wow, that just set the tone for that series. Isn't it?
Yeah, it's also worth remembering all these, ideas of what you have to do to win in Australia. A year ago, India basically did everything you're not supposed to do, but ended up using 20 players, bowled out for 36 in the first Test, and went on to win the series. So maybe that's the plan this time.
We'll see. And just talking about Mr. Johnson, he will be part of our commentary team over the next month or two.